After wishing everyone Boker Tov, we're here on Daf Gimel Amid Beis, and I wanted to discuss something that we covered yesterday, but I found something very interesting. And we're talking about the father who brings forward a contribution of Shekalim, of Masechet Shekalim on behalf of his son. And the Mishnah says, Kol katan shehischil aviv lishkol al yado shuveinu posek. Once the father has, on one occasion, offered the truma of Masechet Shekalim on behalf of his son is less than 20 years old, he's not a bar chiyuv, and then the father now has accepted upon himself an obligation, a commitment to give on an annual basis until the son becomes 20 years old, a Masechet Shekalim. And I found a number of issues with this regard. Number one, would there be a din of mimashkinin? If you take a look carefully at the Mishnah at the beginning, the ratio of the Mishnah here on Daf Gimel Amid Beis formulates the halach of mimashkinin. And on the list is Levim, Yisraelim, Gerim, Avodim. And then the Mishnah goes on to discuss Ketanim. And there's no mashkon in Ketanim. Then the Mishnah says, but once the father has begun to give on behalf of his son, then he's obligated on an annual basis until the son reaches the age of 20. But the Mishnah fails to put this back into the ratio. Are we meant to understand that? Meaning, we have a list of Memashkinin, A, B, C, and D. Then we went off on a tangent for those who are not Memashkinin. There's no Mashkon, which we had Noshim, and we have Avodim, and we have Ketanim. And now the Mishnah mentions the case where the father has begun to give on behalf of his son, who's, in quotation marks, a Katan in this regard. Does that put it back into the ratio, in which case there's a din of a mashkinin with regard to the father once he has come forward with his contribution on the first time? So this is a machlokas rishonim. The Meiri says that now we're back to memashkinin. Once the chiyuv has emerged, because his chilu, the father began lishkol al yado, then it's back into the original ratio of the Mishnah of memashkinin. And in the Masifti quotes Rabbeinu Mishulam, one of the Rishonim, who says it can't be. How can it be memashkinin? Just because the father took upon himself a very exciting voluntary obligation. Okay, you can accept upon yourself a voluntary obligation, but it's basically voluntary. It's a nedav on his part. There's no din of memashkinin on someone who takes upon himself an obligation which is inherently, essentially voluntary. It's optional on his part. Obviously, even before we budge, we understand that there's a fundamental machlokas here between the Meiri and Rabbeinu Mishulam. They're arguing as to whether or not a person who accepts upon himself a chiyuv now becomes a bar chiyuva henceforth, like any other bar chiyuv. Or to put it in other terms, the machlokas revolves around whether or not we have a chiyuv mamon, which in Shekalim we know that there's a chiyuv mamon, and that's the underlying logic of memashkin. The whole premise and the whole halach of memashkin is based on a chiyuv mamon. When you owe me, then if you don't pay me and you default on that loan, Bezdin has rights to confiscate your property. And here too, the Torah obligates you to pay the Masechet Shekalim, becomes the chiyuv mamon, and therefore memashkin. And now, according to the Meiri at least, we're going to take the chiv of the father and put it back into the parish of Shekalim, and therefore there's a din of a mashkin. According to Rabbeinu B'Shulam, this is a mitzvah. This is a chova of Orachaim, call it Yeridea, but don't call it Kodesh Mishpat. There's no monetary obligation that he's taken upon himself. He didn't sign a shtar. The Torah didn't obligate him to pay on behalf of his son. Call it a kiyum mitzvah, but don't call it a chiv mama. In other words, basically, according to Rabbeinu B'Shulam, when we talk about the father's obligation here, it really belongs to a different area of halacha. It expresses itself in shkolim. His chiyuv is to pay the shkolim, but it's not a chiyuv shkolim. This is not to be placed. The machayev is not the mitzvah of shkolim. In mitzvah of shkolim, the father's not chayev to pay shekel on behalf of his son. And that leads to my next question. Where is this chiyuv rooted? Where does it begin from? If you're saying, like the Meiri, it goes back into the chiyuv shkolim, that somehow magically the father has now expanded his mitzvah of shkolim to include a mitzvah to give shekel on behalf of his son. And the other day we mentioned, similar to the father's obligation to make sure that his son is gemalt, then I understand where it's rooted. It's rooted in the parsha of shkolim. And perhaps we can reiterate what we said in the Rambam and put it now into the Meiri, that the Rambam holds that basically the son is chayav. However, the father is picking up the son's chiyuv, but the chiyuv is rooted and is generated by the parsha of shkolim. Hence, there's a din of a mashkin. However, if we go with Rabbeinu B'Shulam, we're not talking about a chiyuv shkolim. In the parsha of shkolim, there's no chiyuv in the father to give shkolim on behalf of his son. So where is it rooted? So we mentioned yesterday the Magen Avram. The Magen Avram says that we're talking about a neder. Again, we have our problems with that. It's not smooth in my mind, because a neder is usually something that you accept upon yourself at least a minimum of 3 times. But here, with some magical reason, we skip we reduce it from 3 down to 1. And 1 time is his chilu is enough to generate this neder. But the Magen Avram says explicitly that this is a neder. In fact, in the Yalkut HaBiurim, he writes, let me just read this to you. He writes, Ubishulchan Aruch HaRav HaMishnah Berurah Kosvu sheyesh lo haTorah. Now, obviously, if they understood that according to the Magen Avram, there is haTorah, we're talking about the parsha of neder. So when the Magen Avram uses the word neder, he means this seriously. And although the Nesivos rejects the idea of haTorah, it could be for other reasons, because it's a question whether you could have haTorah on nidrei mitzvah. This already goes into the nitty-gritties of Hilchos Nedarim. But one thing I see clear, that the Achronim, the Rav Shulchan Aruch, the Mishnah Berurah, they're taking the Magen Avram very, very seriously to his word, and we're talking about Nedarim. So the chiyuv shkolim is not rooted in the parsha of shkolim, in the case of a father who pays for his son, but rather in the parsha of Nedarim. We open up to parshas Matos rather than parshas Kitisa. And if that be the case, that really opens up a whole new vista to understand it's Rabbeinu B'Shulam. Rabbeinu B'Shulam is asking, how can you talk about Memashkinin? We don't find in Nedarim any sort of halacha of Memashkinin. At best, you can talk about kofin ala mitzvos. If a person refuses to fulfill Motzis Vasecha Tishmar, then like any other mitzvah in the Torah, we can pressure him. We can coerce him. Hachiyoma Rotzani. Kofin ala mitzvahs. But again, here we go back to the Minchas Chinuch, if you remember, from 2 days ago. The Minchas Chinuch wonders whether or not we're dealing with kofanal and mitzvahs, or we're dealing with a chiyuv mammon and a shibud nechasim in choshen mishpat terms. Says the Minchas Chinuch, if we're talking about kofanal and mitzvahs, it's got to be b'fanav. If we're talking about collection from his property to pay up a choshen mishpat chov and a shibud, if it's even shalom b'fanav, the man is down in Orlando, Florida, and we're going to confiscate his possessions here in Yerushalayim. But if it's kofin al mitzvahs is not a din of shibud mammon. It's a pressure tactic. We're going to say to him, look, my friend, if you don't fulfill this mitzvah, we'll do it for you by taking a Masechet Shekel out of your bank account and transferring it over to the Truvas al Lishka. But kofin al mitzvahs requires b'fanav. He's got to be there. He's not out in Florida sunning himself in the middle of this pandemic. And therefore, there would be a tremendous nafkamina here if we go back to our original question of whether or not the mamashkin applies in the case of the father vis-a-vis his son, whereas the Meiri would hold this mamashkin, and the Meiri would go all the way with this. Mamashkin afil shalom b'fanav. Whereas according to Rabbeinu Meshulam, if our interpretation is correct, that we're not rooted, the chiyuv is not rooted in the parsha of Shekalim, but rather in the parsha of Nedarim, and therefore Rabbeinu Meshulam might agree that although there's no mamashkin and there is kofin al mitzvahs, a person took a neder, he's obliged to fulfill his neder, but that would only be b'fanav. Now, the next issue that again I was unaware of yesterday, with regard to the father who's paying for his son, is what happens if the father dies and the son is still not 20. He's in that middle period, the adolescence we'll call it, between the age of 13 and Shtei Saras on the one hand, and Ben Esrim Shon on the other hand. So here too we find a machlokas rishonim. The Bartanura on this Mishnah, based on his understanding of the Rush, says that now the son is obligated on his own in the mitzvah of Masechet Shekalim, despite the fact that he's less than 20 years old. Got to be bar mitzvah, he's 13 plus Shtei Saros. So the Tosas Yantiv, who's the later super commentary on the Mishnayos, in the old days when we learned Mishnayos, the Ayin Beis, if you remember. So we just start with the Bartanura, and then we go to the Tosas Yantiv. Tosas Yantiv is almost a critique on the Bartanura, but that's not really accurate. There's many chidushim in the Tosas Yantiv. And he says, what are you talking about? The father took it upon himself to offer the Masechet Shekel, and now it's gestarben. So that's it. We bury his chiyuv with him. As we say, he's niftar, he's part of mitzvahs. How does that obligate the son? Did the son ever take upon himself a mitzvah? And Rabbosai, I derive from this Bartanura an unbelievable conclusion that basically what the father is doing, he's activating the chiyuv that's inherent, that's in potential in the son, on the son. And when the Torah says that in the census we will only count the people who are 20 years and up, and we will ask them to bring forward a Masechet Shekel. So we'll count the money and not the people. That doesn't mean that the mitzvah of Masechet Shekel emerges with a new shear of godless called 20 years old. No. The kapara element that's necessary in the case of the census, because again, you always have to ask the question of this week's parsha. why does HaKadosh Baruch Hu want us to take a census when it's so dangerous? And we avoid counting. Why count the people? What was the necessity? What was the that's more for the Mefarshei Torah, the more of a philosophical kind of a question. But we're not undermining the sheer of godless and the chiyuv mitzvahs that applies to all mitzvahs in the Torah, including shkolim. It's a whole nother pshat. So we're not going to force the ben who's less than 20 to pay shkolim, but there really is, in hiding, so to speak, Aryeh Yehuda Karavyale, he's waiting to jump out like the bull in a Spanish bullfight. He's waiting to come out, just free him. There is a chiyuv inherent in the son. And basically, the father is upgrading that chiyuv of the son from a potential chiyuv to an actual chiyuv, a full-fledged chiyuv. And the father takes it upon himself to fulfill his son's chiyuv. And again, the paradigm is milah, because in milah, the father is fulfilling the milah of the son. And the moment that the son becomes bar mitzvah and he's on his own, independent of his father, he's chayav to be mal himself. And the entire din that a father who wasn't mal his son cannot bring the korban pesach is a pella. Why is that so? Korban pesach is a chiyuv karetz. Now, milah is a chiyuv karetz as well, but that's as far as the son is concerned. The father is guilty for not fulfilling a mitzvah aseh vis-a-vis his son of circumcising his son, but that's just a mitzvah aseh. So his non-fulfillment of a mitzvah aseh is going to exclude him from korban pesach, which is a chiyuv karetz. I mean, that's a pella. The Torah went out of its way to spell that out, but it's something that has to be understood within the halachic framework. But that's not for us today, Baruch Hashem. What we have to know is that there are chiyuvim that are on the son, like milah, which on a temporary basis is now incumbent upon the father vis-a-vis his son, but the chiyuv is fundamentally on the son. In fact, there's a famous tshuva, the Marik, I believe, as to why the Rambam says that the bracha of milah should be lamul es beno. And the Marik quotes Rishonim that it should be al ha-milah, because the father is only a shliach of the son. And whenever the mitzvah is performed by a shliach, it shifts from a lamed to an al. Here's a case where, again, I don't know Hilchas Brachas here in terms of shkolim, Asher Kitzonim Mitzvosav Tifanu Al Mitzvah Shkolim, the father should be reciting, because he's fundamentally fulfilling the son's chiyuv. And I'll prove it to you, because the Rav Bar Tanura says that if the father dies, then the son is obligated in the mitzvah of shkolim. So it means that the chiyuv that the father picked up is the chiyuv of his son. Again, it sheds a whole other light on what's going on here. And I'm convinced that we're dealing with a doraisa according to this approach, rather than some sort of takanas chacham. Okay, that's what I wanted to add. I had some machshavas here since yesterday that I wanted to share with you. So now we're going to start the Gemara that we're up to here on Daf Gimel Amid Beis, and you're looking for Kani. Not Kani with a kuf, but Kani with a chaf. Okay, so let's see where we can find that on Daf Gimel Amid Beis, where the Gemara starts after the top Mishnah. It's approximately 5 lines down, 6 lines down from the beginning of the Gemara. If it helps you, if it helps anybody, then the first word in the line is saros, which is actually in parentheses. I don't know, Mitch, I'm not sure if this helps you, because does Rabbi Steinzal have the same Tzus Hadaf? No, so it doesn't really help you much. Ah.
He's not even on Shekalim.
Oh, you're kidding. So you're using a regular...
Don't be silly. Yes, Shekalim. I have it in front of me.
It's Yerushalmi, not on Bavli.
No, it's in the Bavli. It's in the
Because
Bavli.
we don't have Bavli on Shekalim.
I go straight from Psachim to Sukkah.
No, not on mine.
You have to get your money back, Mitch.
At the end of Psachim, there's Shekalim. What can I tell you?
No, not with me.
Look it up again, Mitch, just to be sure, because I think you have a taina against those who sold it to you.
It's an old edition.
But Sammy, if I have you online here, in your Steinsalz, do you have the same Tzuras Hadaf that, in other words, if I tell you the line starts with the word Yisrael, it doesn't help you one bit?
No.
All right. So I apologize for that.
No, but it's Masudar here, so it's easy to find.
But let's say, for example, if I tell you that there are two Mishnayos on Gimel and Beis, that makes sense, right?
Yes.
Okay, so no, because sometimes if there are two Mishnayos on a page, and I want to give you a reference point, so we're all on the same line, I can tell you it's between two Mishnayos. At least that's like the father starting at Taschol.
On every Amud, it has the same numbers of words, but it's organized differently.
I see. So sometimes if I say to you it's 6 lines down after the beginning of the Gemara, that's helpful for you. If I tell you the first word in the line is Yisrael, that doesn't help. Doesn't help you.
Yeah.
All right. So now let's just introduce this Gemara. The Gemara now is bothered by the phrase with regard to the Kohanim. So today's discussion is about the Kohanim and their mitzvah or lack thereof vis-a-vis Shekalim. Where do the Kohanim fit in the entire constellation of the mitzvah of Shekalim? So one thing is clear, that there's no din of Mamashkinin with regard to the Kohanim. But as we discussed yesterday, when we were speaking about a katan, there are different levels, right? For example, if the child is less than bar mitzvah age, then he's not chayav at all in shkolim. It might be a mitzvah of chinuch, but that's about it. Once he reaches bar mitzvah, he could be chayav in shkolim, but there's no din of mamashkin. Then he reaches the age of 20, and now we kick in with the level of mamashkin. So we have different levels. With regard to Kohanim, the Mishnah omits Kohanim on the list of those categories that are mamashkin. So the Kohen is not subject to mamashkin, and we cannot be mamashkin the Kohen for shkolim, but we can expect, and the Kohen is obligated to bring forth on his own his machzis hashek. And if he's obligated, no less than the Levi, and we'll soon see that the Gemara is going to derive from a pasuk. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is going to derive from a pasuk that a Kohen is no less chayiv than a Levi, etc., etc. Then why ain't mamashkin? So the Mishnah says because of darkei sholem, and that's what we're up to now. The Gemara doesn't sit well with the Gemara darkei sholem. Any masnisa. Now, again, I'm so influenced by the Lashon Bavli that I thought Kani means, is this so? But no, that's not in the Yerushalmi, that's what it is. Kani means that what I'm going to tell you now is correct. Kani, in the Hebrew translation, Kach Tzarech Lefarish Masnisa, the words of the Mishnah. And here, I have to tell you that according to, again, I don't know, I'm not familiar with these forum, but there's a sefer called Pesher Davar. Okay, we could research it, but it's not important to me right now. One of the Achronim points out that Keni Masnisa, in this context, and I don't know if it means it always, because again, I'm not familiar with Yerushalmi, Eschatoyani Maskir, I never learned Yerushalmi. But according to the Pesha Dover, at least Keni Masnisa means you've got the wrong text of the Mishnah. So Keni Masnitza is not just a biur on the Mishnah, and let me give you the right shot, but Keni Masnitza means let me give you the right text of the Mishnah. Cross out the words Darkei Shalom and replace it with the words Derech HaKavod. What's the difference? Call it Shalom, call it Kavod. And the answer is that Darkei Shalom has nothing to do with Kohanim. We don't have any extra obligation with regard to Kohanim of Darkei Shalom. Let's keep up good relations with the Kohanim. And if we send the Shliach of Beis Din to confiscate his kitchen table and sell it on the market, that upsets or undermines the Shalom relation between Beis Din and the Kohanim. That's not so. That's true for our relationship with every single Jew, maybe even with Goyim. So that concept of Darkei Shalom is not specific. It's not a good fit for Kohanim. But there is in our relationship to Kohanim a special mitzvah, and that's mitzvah is called Kavod HaKohanim. The Torah says V'kidashto. That's why we give Kohen the first Aliyah. Although I'm not, according to the Gemara, I'm not sure that's always the case, but that's how the minhag evolved. And benching, and even going out of a room, you should really give a Kohen the first rights to go out of the room. That's a mitzvah of V'kidashto. Kavod for the Kohen. And it upsets the kavod that we have for the Kohanim when we go into his house and we confiscate his property. Moreover, it upsets his kavod if we suspect him that he on his own is not going to come forward willingly and bring his matzah shekel. So kavod Kohanim here expresses itself in the fact that, yes, the Kohen is obligated to matzah shekel. Yes, he is somehow delayed bringing it forward, but Kavod Kohanim means rely on the Kohen. He's good for his word. He will fulfill the mitzvah of matzah shekel. Just be patient. The money will be forthcoming. And that extra respect for a person who is delayed in fulfilling his monetary obligation, that's a kiyum of kavod. And in the case of Kohanim, we're obligated in that kavod. However, here we have a whole new pshat in the Rash Tzur. The Rash Tzur says that even if the Kohen doesn't come forward with his matzah shekel, and even if we're not going to be mamashkin, he, the Kohen, will fulfill his mitzvah matzah shekel. I mean, that's wild. I mean, that's like saying A and not A at the same time. The Rash Tzur says the Kohen doesn't come forward with his matzah shekel. We are not going to be mamashkin also, and yet he was makayim the mitzvah of matzah shekel. How did that happen? And here the Rash Tzur invokes a principle which is called Leiv Beis Din Masna. I don't know if you're familiar with that. The encyclopedia, I don't think got up to Lamed. Did it? I don't know. Maybe it did already. I dropped out at Chaf, so I don't know if they have Lamed already. Leiv Beis Din Mas. And it's amazing halacha. And to quote the language of the Rash Mishan, the Rash Tzur, he writes, Leiv Beis Din Masna Lehem, Lizkos Lahem Machzis HaShekel, Mitoch Shumas Halishka Atzma. And then he tells you why, which I'm going to hold off for a minute. It's kind of like in our so-called Zeichel Matzah Shekel, right? So what do? You don't have a Matzah Shekel. You go into the Kuppah, there's a bowl, and you pick up a Matzah Shekel, and you cone it for yourself. So there's something called the Shumas Halishka. And Leiv Beis Din Masna will authorize the Beis Din to go into the Trumas Halishka and actually pick up a Machzis HaShekel that was given and donated by somebody else and be Zocher in that Machzis HaShekel on behalf of the Kohen and put it back into the Trumas Halishka. It's an amazing mechanism. Says the Rosh Hashanah, why do we do such a thing? Why doesn't he come forward with his own Masechet Shekalim? Okay, Mishum Kovid, they're not Mamashkin also. But it's his obligation. And he adds 3 words. Kischar al avodosa. Now, wait a second. First of all, I'd like to believe that the Kohen lives off Truma and 23 other Matnas Kahuna. I never knew that we have to pay a salary to the Kohen. Again, I have Hakaras HaTov to the Kohanim, like today, for example, for Duchenin, but at the time of the Mikdash for doing the Avodah. And the Avodah is very, it's very cumbersome. They have to train. And forget about the Kohen Gadol. I mean, that's already Masechet Yoma, what the Kohen Gadol has to do on Yom Kippur. But even a Kohen Hedjon, so many different halachas and Big Day Kahuna and Kiddush Yadayim V'Raglayim and he has to get the machshava right for to be machshav the carbon and bring about the kapara. And there's a lot on the plates of a Kohen. So we need to recognize his avodah by offering him. Again, I don't want to call it, even though the Rosh Hashanah does use the word schar avodah, I would call it an honorarium. Do you know what I mean by that? Like, let's say, for example, they call you up from a nonprofit organization like a shul or a school, and they ask you to give a lecture. You're an expert on heart disease, right? So come on the eyes, right? On ophthalmology. So give me the boys are learning in high school, somewhere in St. Louis, I don't know where. Come and give us a lecture for the Yeshiva Bachrim to learn about the eye. You know what I mean? So the people who brought you in, they don't owe you a salary because you accepted it. This is a nice thing. You're part of the Jewish community. Here's a chance to, to share your knowledge with the boys. But then they call you up and they say, you know what, Dr. So-and-so, we want to send you an honorarium. So to the Kohen. The Kohanim are doing the avodah, but we want to give them an extra push and an extra schar, and that's the Rosh Hashanah. If I would stop here, honestly, I would be very unsatisfied. This doesn't satisfy me. But the Rosh Hashanah goes on, and listen to the punchline. He says, "Kifi shayu nosnim schar me'al lishka l'shar osei meleches hakodesh." He says that there's a precedent to this. Again, for this, we have to learn more of Masechet Shekalim. But what we're going to find out is that the Trumas Halishka had another function, which we're not aware of, perhaps. Besides buying Karbanos Tzibur, it was used to fix up any damages, like we call a plumber, right? There's a leak. And that could happen in the Beis HaMikdash. There's a lot of water going on, this way and that way, the kiyar and the oven of the mizbeach, and now we have a leak, or there's a crack. And we have a whole sugim psachim about a crack in the Kodesh Kadoshim, and no one's allowed to enter in there. So they used to lower him with a pulley, the workers, into the Kodesh Kadoshim, so they shouldn't see the beauty of the Kodesh Kadoshim. That might be an Isur Me'ilah. In any event, says the Rosh Hashanah, where does the money come from to pay the workers? The plumbers and the carpenters and all the tanners, all the different people who are doing Melechas HaKodesh. They have to be paid. There's no Matnas Kahuna. There are no matanos for the Osei HaMalacha. It comes from the Trumas Halishka. So we already have a precedent for paying salaries for the sake of the avodah, so that the avodas hamishkan, so that Mikdash could be up and running from the Trumas Halishka. And now, if the Kohen fails to bring forward his Masechet Shekalim, he's tarud, he's giving shiurim all over the country, and he's doing the avodah in the Beis Hamikdash, and he, for whatever reason, again, if he's amazing and we have reason to believe that he's deliberate, I don't know. I don't know what the Rosh Hashanah would say. But assuming, for whatever reason, he, not out of a manner of deliberate negligence, but it fell between the cracks, well, now let's recognize all the avodah that he does for us, the tircha, the sweat, and we're going to pay him a salary. From whence? From the Truvas Halishka. Once I do that, Leiv Best and Master, I take money out of the Truvas Halishka, and I'm mezakeh to him as payment, as schar, and then I put the money back into the Truvas Halishka. Why am I doing that? So that the Kohen could now fulfill his obligation of shkola. I'm telling you, I get emotional about this because, you can learn this Gemara from now until Mashiach. You can review it 50 times and miss a whole new interpretation, Shivim Panim Torah, about this halacha of Kavod Kohen. And all the other Rishonim, all other the Mefarshim say that we're going to rely on the Kohen. Don't worry, he'll come through in the clutch. Eventually, he will get around to it and he'll come forward with his Machzah Shekel. We don't need to use these very massive machinery here of Mamashkin in order to extract from him the Machzah Shekel. Let's rely on him. And by relying on him, we're Makayim the mitzvah of Vikidashto of Kavod Kohen. Comes to Rosh Hashanah and he says a whole nother shot. We don't have to rely on him. If he doesn't bring the Machzah Shekel, he will bring the Machzah Shekel. We will bring it forward by giving zocher in the schar of his avodah from the Truvas Halishka. Pretty way out. Okay. Now, I have to share with you what I consider the most radical pshat in this Gemara that we just learned. Again, I'm not familiar with the names here of the various commentaries. And this is quoted here in the name of the Talmud of the Rash Barash. So I don't know who the Rash Barash is. And what I'd like to do is, although the Masifta quotes this on the page, he had short notes on the page, but he quotes it more in Arichus, in the back of the Gemara, in the Yalkut HaBi'uri. And he writes the following. Pirish Talmud Rash Barash. Maybe his Rebbe's name was Reb Shimon ben Reb Shmuel or something. Rash Barash. Ein memashkin son. Why is there no din of mashkon with regard to the Kohen? After all, the Kohen is chayim. We're going to learn from a pasuk in a minute that the Kohenim are chayim. So in our Yerushalmi it says because of covet. And he says something else. He says that there's actually a suffix whether they're chayav on it. Now, again, I'm stopping middle, pressing the pause button here. When he says a suffix, he's referring to Rabbi Yehuda in our Mishnah, Heid ben Bukhri b'Yavni. Remember our good friend Ben Bukhri, BB, Ben Bukhri in Yavne, that the Kohanim decided, based on their understanding of the Torah law, that they are exempt from the Machzah Shekel. And then we have Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai who says Lo Kain. They misinterpreted the pasuk. We don't know if they did it deliberately or inadvertently. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is going to set us straight. But from the testimony of Ben Bukhari, we see clearly that there are two possibilities as to how to interpret the pasuk, which we'll get to in right now. Now, before we saw this Mefaresh, we thought that the original interpretation, which Ben Bukhari attributes to the Kohanim, is completely wrong. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai successfully got rid of it, smashed it to smithereens. In other words, the halacha of elu ve'elu divrei l'kim chayim does not apply in this case. It's absolutely crystal clear that the Torah says a Kohen is chayiv and machzah shekel. And all the drushes of the Kohanim, I mean, there was only one, but the drush of the Kohanim, it's totally off base. It doesn't, you don't apply elu ve'elu. There's no machlokas about whether Kohanim are chayiv and shkolim. They're clearly chayiv and shkolim. That's the impression we got until we see this mafar. And he says, you know why ain't memashkenim? He says because yesh lahem lakonim raya, they have a proof min haTorah she'ena mechuyavim, and we disagree with them. Aval amotzi mechavero all of a raya. The ein lanu raya mechuveres listar es rayosam. I'll say again, I have to submit to you, this is a total revamp of the Gemara. Total revolution. We cannot force them to pay the shkolim because hamotzi mechavel a raya. We have a raya that they owe. They have a raya that they don't owe. It's status quo. L'chein lo hayu memashkenos. Vatam shein memashkenos, so who mishum sofek. It's a suffix. Now, Rabosai, I just want to point out the repercussions of what he's saying over here. First of all, the Gemara, as we'll soon see, is going to vacillate about the Levium, because the Levium were not counted. There were two pekudos. In one pekuda, the Levium were included, in one they were not. In Parshas Kitisa, they were included because they needed to be protected from the Negev. But later on, in Sefer Bamidbar, we have another Pekude, and the Levium, Lois Pakad, they were not included in the counting. So the Gemara is going to vacillate back and forth as to whether Levium are chayiv in Machzah Shekel. Comes out according to this Mefaraj that we can't force the Levium to pay Machzah Shekel because Hamotzi B'Chaver Levraya. Secondly, what would be if the Kohanim are boasting, well, you prove to me the burden of proof that I'm chai because I have a pasuk that says, in my interpretation of the pasuk, I'm not chai. What happens if you're dealing with dinei sfeikus, if we went ahead and we grabbed the machzah shekel? We shouldn't have done so, but we did so. Now Hamotzi Mechavel of Harai goes in the opposite direction. Now the Kohen wants to say, well, give me back my machzah shekel, and I have a proof. So we say to him, what do you mean? Your proof contradicts our understanding of the Torah. Go prove it. And that's called tfisa, which is a sugya, one of the most famous sugyas in Shas, called takfa Kohen. So you have a suffix b'char, and the Kohen go ahead and he grabbed the b'char. We can't collect it and force him to cough it up because Hamotzi Mechavel of Harai. But the most revolutionary dimension of what he's saying here is that even Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai would have to agree that the Kohanim had an interpretation. He, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, disagrees with that interpretation, but Eilu Ve'elu Divrei L'kim Chayim. And therefore, we can't force them to be, we can't be Mamashkin, we can't aggressively and actively take the Machzah Shekel from their possession. So what is the machlokas here about Kohen, if you want to call it a machlokas? Amar Rabbi Yehuda, hey, ben Bukhri v'yavna kol Kohen sheshokel eino chote, that the Kohanim are potter from the mitzvah of Machzah Shekel, and if they want to voluntarily offer the Machzah Shekel, it's fine, and it's not a chet. The Kohanim are in fact chayav. We can't be mamashkin them, but they're obligated to bring forward the Masechet Shekel. And if they fail to do so, they're called Chotim. Amar Abrechya, Taima de Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. How and why was Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai so absolutely sure of himself that the Kohanim are chayav in Masechet Shekel? I was hoping for some almost explicit pasuk. Instead, it's a bit of what I would call a remez. Ze yitnu. The pasuk says, Ze yitnu kol over al apkudim Masechet HaShekel. How many people here today are into gematrios? I don't see any hands going up. Well, today we all have to be into gematrios. What's the gematria of the word Ze? Usually I need a calculator. Here I don't need a calculator. 7 plus 5 is 12. Shneimasa shvatim yitnu. Ze yitnu means all 12 shvatim will contribute. I got only one problem. Last time I counted, there were 13 shvatim. There's Ephraim and Menashe. Who says that the number 12 includes Kohanim? If the Kohanim had a drasha, which we'll soon learn about, and they based on their conclusion that they're not chayav in Masechet Shekel, then I know why the word Zeh is 12 shvatim, because we're talking about Yosef being divided up into two. That doesn't prove that the Kohanim are included in the chiyuv of Zeh Yitnu. Comes along the Rash Leo, and he says that what Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai has in mind are the 12 shvatim that are represented on the choshen of the Kohen Gadol by the 12 precious stones. Not the 12 shvatim that were counted in Chumash HaPkudim, meaning in Sefer Bamidbar, because there Shevet Levi was not counted, but Shevet Levi had a stone and was represented in the Choshen. I read the Gemara here in front of my eyes, and I don't see any reference here to the Choshen. But who am I to disagree with the Rash Leo? I don't even have another answer to his question. He's saying that Ze Yitnu is the number 12 Shvatim, includes the Leviim, Shevet Levi, which includes the Kohanim, obviously, because they were included in the number 12 as far as the stones that were worn on the breastplate of the Kohen Gadol. I don't have a better answer. Okay. Now, let's assume that we can line up the shittas in the following way. We have Rabbi Yehuda and Ben Bukhri. Again, even though I have to admit Rabbi Yehuda didn't really commit himself one way or the other, but the fact that he says Hayed Ben Bukhri sounds like he's relying on the Eidus of Ben Bukhri, that the Kohanim had a virtuous and reliable drasha to exempt themselves from Masechet Shekel. And the Tanakama of Mishnah omitted Kohanim in the list of a Mashkedin, also implying that the Kohanim have an iffy, if at all, any sort of chiyuv in Shkolim. And then we have Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. The Kohanim themselves came to the conclusion that they are exempt from the mitzvah of Shkolim. Rabbi Tavi b'shem Rav Hamnuna ein meshivim. Now the word meshivim, even in the Bavli, means to upshlug. Kain meshivim chachamim l'Rabbi Yehuda. In other words, the chachamim are going to prove that the Kohanim are chayav in shkolim. Now, in order to appreciate the proof of the Chachamim against Rabbi Yehuda, what we need to do is we have to understand the logic of the Kohen so that we can slug them up. So we go back to our Mishnah, and the Mishnah says, Kol minchas Kohen kolil tia lo socher. Hoil the omer ushtei alechem alechem aponim shalanu heich nechol. Brilliant. The Kohanim say the following: if we come forward with our Masechet Shekel, which is now going to be used to purchase a carbon tzibur, there are 3 karbanos tzibur that are menachos. And with regard to menachos, we have Allah that minchas kohen is kolil. The Torah says you have to burn it. It's the only mincha that's not eaten by what we call shirayim lezichrei kahuna. And that is a minchas kohen. When a kohen comes forward with his carbon mincha, it's kulei kolil. Don't ask me why. For that, you have to learn Kabbalah, I guess, or some sort of Tameat mitzvahs. But it's Xeris HaKos. So the Kohanim argue, if we're going to contribute to the Trumas HaLichka, now you're going to go out and buy, with that money, a Minchas HaTzibur, for example, Minchas HaOmer, then that money, which came from us, means that now the carbon itself is a Minchas Kohen. If it's a Minchas Kohen, then it's Kolil. Obviously, then, we must derive the conclusion that we're not chayav in the Trumas Shkolim. So the Chachamim now invoke as a counter argument against the Kohanim, this argument represented by Rabbi Yehuda and Mishnah, the halach of chamesh chatos mesos. And this is a halacha l'moshe misinai that differentiates in a very fundamental way between a carbon tzibur and a carbon yochid. If a yochid brings a carbon chatos, there are 5 scenarios in which we will burn the chatos. The 5, I'm sorry, that was a mistake what I just said. Not that we'll burn it, but mesos means that we'll have to lock up the animal until it dies. We will not feed the animal. I shouldn't say this out loud because the ASPCA and all those who love animals are going to come yelling, Tsar Bali Chaim. Okay, we'll have to figure out what our counter argument is. But that's chatos ha-mesos. So, for example, if the chatos was designated by Reuven and then Reuven died, there's no one to bring the chatos. So what do you do with such a chatos? So when there's a psul in the gufa carbon, then we have something called iber tzura. You know, we just wait until the animal is nosar, and then we burn it. But in the case of chatos ha-mesos, where there's no psul in the gufa carbon, then we cannot burn the carbon. You're burning kachim. So we cause the death of the animal. We lock it up. That's not true with regard to a carbon tzibur. A carbon tzibur is not subject to the law of chatos ha-mesos. Therefore, chatos yochid mesa, ein chatos tzibur mesa, which is based on a principle called ein misa b'tzibur, the concept of misa. Like, for example, if a Yochid Reuven brings a carbon chatos and he dies, he died. And if he died, there's no bilam on the carbon. Hence, the carbon will go down, the way of all flesh. But in a case of a tzibur, there's no such thing as the tzibur mesa. The tzibur is not subject to mesa. Netzach Yisrael. And therefore, there's no din of chatos ha-mesos with regard to a carbon tzibur. That be the case, say the Chachamim, there's a clear fundamental distinction here between a carbon yachid and a carbon tzibur. And therefore, minchas ha-yachid kreva kolil, the ein minchas ha-tzibur kreva kolil. Another nafkamina between a carbon yachid and a carbon tzibur is in the case of menachas. Because if the mincha is a personal mincha of a Kohen, the Torah says kolil. But in the case of a mincha that's brought by the tzibur, the Torah says that we eat the shirayim and it's not kolil. Therefore, even if the Kohen comes along and he contributes his shkolim and it goes into the Trumas HaLishka, just one second. So it goes into the Trumas HaLishka. So I made a mistake in terms of the Makshin and the Tartzin here, where I thought Rabbi Yehuda. I think I'm right. So Rabbi Yehuda says that the Kohanim are patur. Is Rabbi Tavi b'shem Rav Hemnuna kach meshivim? Meaning the Chachamim that say that the Kohanim are chayav in Machzas Shekel, what are they going to answer to Rabbi Yehuda? Is chatas yochid mesa v'ein chatas tzibur mesa. So we see clearly that the Torah differentiates between a chatas of a yochid and a chatas of the tzibur. So if that be the case, then minchas kohen of a yachid is what? Is kreva kolil. So there's no din of achila shirayim. The ein minchas hatzibur kreva kolil. Oh, I see. You see, I thought that the Gemara now, in these words, right, differentiating between the Yochid and the Tzibur the Gemara has now upslugged Rabbi Yehuda and proven that the Kohanim are chayav in Shumas of Shkolim. That's not so. We didn't even get to the Raya yet. The Gemara takes a digression at this point. And the Gemara asks Rabbi Tavi, the kasha meshiva li'odem davar she'eino modebo. I don't say it, even before you explicate the kasha, the Rabbanan, and their rejection of Rabbi Yehuda, this is not fair. They're going to reject Rabbi Yehuda based on the fact that chatas hatzibur lo mesa. Ein meshiva li'odem davar she'eino modebo. You can't slug up someone based on a premise which he rejected. This nan, we have a Mishnah in Yuma. Ein chatas tzibur mesa, Rabbi Yehuda omer tamus. Rabbi Yehuda holds that there is no distinction between a chatas yachid and a chatas tzibur, and even if it's a chatas tzibur, we're going to apply the principle of mesa. So, what right do the Chachamim have to prove, or let's say it this way, to disprove Rabbi Yehuda based on the fact that chatas tzibur lo mesa when Rabbi Yehuda holds chatas tzibur mesa? Now, what does Rabbi Tavi, what does he respond to this argument here of Ein Meshivin Li'adam Davar She'eino Modebo? So the truth is, he didn't bother even answering that question. So I guess we have to assume that the question of the Chachamim against Rabbi Yehuda is not really based on the fact that Chatas Tzibur lo Mesa, but it's based on the fact that Minchas Hayachid is Kolil. V'hu Mosiv lo zu lo nidvas Yachid he. Ve'inem B'siven le Kevan Shenimso L'Tzibur Kemishu Nidvas Tzibur. In other words, again, we'll pick this up tomorrow, but the point here is that on the one hand, Rabbi Yehuda, who maintains that the Kohanim are not chayav in shkolim, he's holding that by allowing the Kohanim to contribute, you've converted the Minchas HaTzibur into Minchas Yachid, and therefore it would have to be Kolil. We know that's not so. The Chacham, on the other hand, say, no, that once the Kohanim come forward with their Masechet HaShekel, they give it as part of the Tzibur. They're not giving it as individuals for their own ownership, private ownership over the Mincha. Kimi shehu nidvas tzibur. It's like they participated in a nidvas tzibur. And that's what it means that Kohen hashokel eino chote, because the Kohanim are giving their money and their Masechet Shekel in a good light, because they want to help the enterprise of Karbanos Tzibur. They're giving it to the Tzibur. They're not claiming private ownership over the Karbanos to make it into a Minchas Kohen, a Minchas Yachid, which is Kohen. Okay, then, so this is where we'll stop, and we'll pick this last point up tomorrow, embellish upon it, the machlokes here between the Chachamim and Rabbi Yehuda. Okay, then, so I wish everyone a great day.